between, I guess, the philosophical aspects of quantum physics, and maybe more specifically the questions that quantum physics raises about the nature of reality, and also the things that I was encountering in my own Zen training and my own Zen practice. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author. So basically what I'm going to talk about tonight is a summary of a chapter of a book that we submitted into the St. Bede's Library. It's a book on quanta and mind, essays on the connection between quantum theories and consciousness. And Brenton Ram was a co-author in that. And Brenton he's actually quite unique. He's a doctor, so he's got one PhD in cognitive psychology. So he was one of my research assistants, and we were working on developing these quantum theoretical models of cognition together. And then he went down to the Australian National University, and he also did a second PhD in philosophy. So he's a Dr. Ram. And then he is also a long-time Zen student. So both of us have this sort of parallel connection between the material, I guess, from the side of quantum physics, but also connections and bridges to Zen. Is everyone still hearing me at the back? Is that all right? So, I don't know. I'm hoping that my slides and the text will be big enough for you to see, but I'll read things out for those at the back that maybe can't read them.
You can pull the screen out, Anita, just if you want.
So I just might see if it's
You bought the fancy one that does it.
yeah. So, yeah.
That would be one. How's that?
So how long do I have actually? I should have known. Okay, so
and then questions.
usually I don't finish, but anyway, I hope this has to, is not only simply because of the presentation, because this particular material, this is I think the fourth time that I've come here and talked essentially about the same subject, but each time there has been a progression and a more deeper investigation into the essential questions that are driving the inspiration for these presentations. Okay, so to start, as Phoebe mentioned in the abstract, I'm going to try and pull together views from three wonderful individuals. For those many of you probably know, Schrödinger was one of the founding fathers of quantum physics. He got a Nobel Prize for his contributions to that field, and so his exalted place in the history of science is indisputable. Then below we have Zen Master Dogen. I don't know really whether he actually looked like that, but this is a 12th century Zen Master. He is the founder of one of the two main schools of Zen Buddhism in Japan today. But he went and trained in China. So he took a boat across from Japan, he trained in China, at the monasteries in China, and then when his master gave him what's called Dharma transmission, he went back to Japan and founded a school based on his experiences and what he learnt in China. So at that time, there was a lot of Zen Buddhism going on. It's called Chan, is the Chinese school of Zen, and it was still very, very active at those times. And essentially, masters like Dogen and others went to train in China and ended up in Japan, and then in Japan and through successive generations, we've got his teachings today. Dogen was unique because Zen masters do write from time to time, but Dogen was a prolific writer, and his major work was called the Shobogenzo, or the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and then depending on how people count it, there were 96 chapters in this particular work. And it's not only prominent within Zen schools, also philosophers have looked at Dogen's works and tried to interpret them from a philosophical point of view. So I'll be sharing some of the things that Dogen had to say, particularly about time. which I think was which are very, very interesting, very, very thought-provoking, and also quite. There's it's almost his views about time very, very challenging for the intellectual mind, and very, very challenging in particular for our common sense notions of time. Okay? And the final one is Nishida Kitaro. It's only recently that I came across Kitaro. He is someone known in philosophical circles. He was a Japanese philosopher, but what's unique about him is that he had a basis in Zen training, and he had a very, very enigmatic philosophy. So when you read some of Nishida's works, it's actually quite difficult to follow. But I think it's very, very deep what Nishida has to say, and I hope with this talk this evening that I can at least give you a small impression of the depth of Nishida's insight into what I'm going to talk about. So that's a bit of an introduction. So let's start with Schrödinger. Okay, so one of the great, I think, beautiful pieces of work that Schrödinger left us was this article he wrote, The Principle of Objectivation. And in this article he was talking about the scientific method. And for those that can't read at the back, I'll read this quote. So without being aware of it, so he's describing this principle of objectivation, without being aware of it and without being rigorously systematic about it, he says, we exclude the subject of cognizance from the domain of nature that we endeavour to understand. So he is talking about scientists that are trying to understand nature, but I would also argue this is also a very apt description of what we do in everyday life. And what is it that we do? He says, we step with our own person back into the part of an onlooker who does not belong to the world, which by this very procedure becomes an objective world. Now this is a very, very striking quote, because normally in science you believe that there are objects out there, right? And the world has an objective sort of nature. And so much of science has been built up around the study of objects, what their properties are, how they relate to each other, how they move, dynamics, etc. Note Schrödinger's quote, he says, by stepping back as an observer, right, so we take this, we step back and we peek sort of out there at this world of objects, and by that very process of stepping back, the objective world is born. So he's saying that this is not the fundamental reality. This is what he's implying here. So, to go to a Zen connection here, and so isn't it true that part of us, quite often we believe that I'm here, right? So I'm this observer here, and the world is out there. Right? And so my task in life, the challenges life, and part of being human is to move around in that so-called external reality, right? To make do, have a life, be happy every now and again. Right? So this is but we are this onlooker to this assumed external reality, which we objectify. There are chairs, there are people, there are rooms, there are paintings. Right? So that we do this all the time. So our object consciousness is very, very strong. Okay, so but Schrödinger is saying that this is not fundamental. By stepping back like that, this is how we're creating this assumed world of a universe of objects. Now, I can't talk about Schrödinger without talking about Einstein, because Einstein was an objective realist, right? And this, so he had this quip about the moon. And he had this problem with quantum physics, because quantum physics was starting to question and eventually sort of undermine the notion of this objective reality. And by that I mean that we have these objects out there that even when we're not looking at them, they have well-established properties and features. And this is what Einstein had to say. He said, I think that a particle, so he's talking about these mysterious quantum particles. Quantum physics was saying, well, you know, by actually measuring, doing a quantum measurement, we create the particle. It's not existing in advance. And Einstein didn't like this. He says, I think that a particle must have a separate reality independent of the measurements. So that means that when there's an electron or a photon, even when we're not observing them with scientific apparatuses or even with our eyes, even when we're not observing, it's out there, right? That an individual photon has well-established properties like momentum and position, even though when we're not observing. So he says, I think the particle must have a separate reality independent of the measurements. That is, an electron has spin, location, and so forth, even when it's not being measured or observed. And then he says, I like to think the moon is there even if I'm not looking at it. So this was his quip against quantum physics. So quantum physics, so Archibald Wheeler said, a quantum particle is not a quantum particle unless it is an observed quantum particle. So outside of any observation, we can't speak meaningfully about a quantum particle. So this is the two sides of the debate. So by presenting them, I want to summarise what I mentioned about this objectified reality in terms of objective realism. So by objective realism, we mean that there are objects out there with well-defined properties, be they photons, be they moons, objects and their properties exist independent of observation. So even though that when we're not observing them, they're out there, they have well-established properties, they're objects that exist independent of observation, prior to observation, and the subject that does the observing is separate from it. So even when we do make observations as a subject, as Schrödinger said, we step back in the shadows, so to speak, and we peek at them. And the assumption is that our observations in no way affect these objects. So we can peek at them, learn something about them, but that's about it. But by doing that, by stepping back into that role of this background observer, we create this objectified reality. So how are we doing so far? Is everyone okay with that? Okay. So it's probably little known. I think certainly those that scientifically engage with Schrödinger's work